people have been emboldened by the fact that they've been working from home. And they realise how much latitude they actually have in terms of how much effort they put in and what results they achieve. There's a lot going on in the world of work right now. The COVID pandemic was a major catalyst for a shift in how people all over the world view their careers, and more importantly, their lives. Now, we've come through the Great Resignation, we've moved on to quiet quitting, and now we're seeing mass layoffs. And the net result of all of this, the latest figures in the US show a steep decline in productivity. Now, these issues are an increasing source of focus for our no bullshit leadership community. With all that's going on, it's good to finally have some hard numbers coming out. And I think we're only now starting to see the scoreboard for many of these work disruptions. Productivity is the measure of hourly output per worker across the whole economy. In the second quarter of 2022, productivity in the US plunged, the largest year-on-year decline since records began. And this is on the back of a sharp decline in Q1. Hours worked increased slightly, while the unit cost of labour continues to increase even more rapidly, by over 10% last quarter. Now, these numbers are problematic no matter how you look at them, and the trend seems set to remain for some time to come. It's probably not a huge surprise with all the disruption that's been going on though. And whereas the causes and effects are complex, I think we're now seeing the scoreboard on the remote working issue. There's still fierce debate on whether productivity has increased or declined. Of course, people who prefer to work from home swear that they're much more productive now than they were before. Well, if that's actually the case, then somehow that productivity isn't being captured. Perhaps it's the proliferation of Zoom meetings that leaders hold to try to keep tabs on everything, and that's sucking up any productivity gains that may have been realised otherwise. Whatever the root causes, the outcomes are entirely predictable. Long-term productivity declines result in a shrinking economy. Quality of life goes down, opportunities dry up, and innovation flees offshore to other economies. And when that happens, everyone blames the government. If it wasn't so serious, it would be comical. The recently coined phenomenon of quiet quitting can be especially tricky. Now, the definition of this varies greatly depending on who you ask. It goes from using up all of your sick leave through to not doing extra work when you don't feel as though there's enough recognition for it. But however you define it, quiet quitting is an unfortunate phrase. At least it shows, though, how quickly these things can take root in the media. Now, there's been a bunch of variations on this theme, but I think people have been emboldened by the fact that they've been working from home. And they realise how much latitude they actually have in terms of how much effort they put in and what results they achieve. And look, it's not necessarily their fault either. Many leaders simply can't lead for results. They can only lead by looking at activity, like time spent at the desk, which has always been a pretty poor measure of productivity. They haven't been able to set appropriate targets and standards for their people, so everything just defaults to the lowest common denominator. And that's relying on the choice of the individual as to how much effort and commitment they put in. And the way many companies have treated their people, it's no wonder that a huge chunk of the workforce is pretty weird and pissed off about how they've been treated since the pandemic hit. But this whole quiet quitting thing isn't a new phenomenon. Since the Industrial Revolution, workers have exercised their power in the only way that they really could, by punishing their employer who treats them poorly with a lack of effort. They withhold their commitment, their productivity, and their discretionary effort, only doing the bare minimum. Now, in the most obvious sense, you see this manifest as strike action. But the more passive-aggressive version of this is to do as little as you can get away with to try to achieve a sense of balancing the scales. And if leaders can't see and deal with this, well, whose fault is that? So the big question is this just a passing phase? Will quiet quitting disappear once the employment market cools and jobs are harder to find? Look, I think it's most likely that things are going to go back to a relative level of normality. And by that, I mean that employers are going to revert to using less overt methods to express their displeasure. People are going to need to be a little bit careful about how they play that game. But I don't know that it's going to change a hell of a lot about productivity, employment or people's lack of satisfaction with the current state of their careers. And when you boil all of this down, it's really about the psychological contract. This concept was first developed about 60 years ago by Chris Argyris, who was a Harvard Business School professor. The psychological contract is the unwritten understanding between an employer and an employee. And I think this has changed a hell of a lot over the last few decades. So back in the 1960s when it was formulated, the psychological contract would have been a very different understanding. The employee's thoughts may well have been back then, I'll come to work for you every day. I'll give you a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. If I'm loyal to the organisation, then the organisation is going to be loyal to me. I'll do what I'm told and give my best efforts. And in return, I expect to be treated with a level of dignity and respect. So there was this sort of mutual understanding that employers and employees would look after each other's interests. If we think about, though, what might sit on the employee side of the psychological contract today, it would be very different and would probably include things like schedule flexibility, meaning and balance, and of course, much higher expectations around pay. So it's as if they'd be saying, I don't expect unwavering loyalty from my employer because it's obvious that those days are gone. Instead, I expect that my employer is going to provide a place where I can earn a good living while having plenty of room for the other things in my life. I want balance. I want my boss to be sensitive to my situation and to cater for my preferences. So for example, working from where I choose, in the manner which I choose. I expect a level playing field and I don't expect to be penalised in my career because of the personal choices that I make in other areas of my life. Now, if I don't feel as though this balance is right and my employer doesn't meet my expectations, I have many ways of exercising my dissatisfaction. The balance of this modern psychological contract will no doubt shift slightly as the job market softens. But of course, not everyone thinks like that. There are people in the workforce who are ambitious and career-oriented, and they're going to continue to seek a high level of success and reward. They will have a completely different psychological contract, and they'll be the ones who receive the opportunities that open up as a result of their hard work, their risk-taking, and their dedication. And in my mind, this is entirely appropriate. The goal should be to create equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes. If someone chooses to put more effort, energy, and commitment into anything, they will earn the success that comes from that. If someone else makes a choice to do less and focus on other areas of their life, well, that's fine. And in fact, it's probably even more sensible. But they can't expect the same career outcomes. We sometimes forget that as leaders, it's not our job to provide the environment for everyone to live their best lives. We have a job to do in delivering value for our organisation. That's why we get paid. So we can't get too carried away with pandering to the demands of our people. It's not good for them, and ultimately, it's not good for the team either. So I guess the question is, are these trends a direct result of COVID, or was this already happening and the pandemic just accelerated it? Well, the evolution of our thinking on what our lives and work should be has evolved over time. And I've already mentioned the gradual but radical shift in the psychological contract. It now seems to be almost a cliche that people have to pursue their life's purpose from a very young age. Now look, I didn't discover my true purpose until my mid-40s. And I didn't actually start to realise that purpose until I started this business at the ripe old age of 56. But here's the important thing to remember. Everything that I did before that time was simply preparing me for what was to come. And if I hadn't done those things and lived that experience, I wouldn't have been able to do what I do now. Some of the most impactful lessons in no bullshit leadership didn't even occur to me until I was in my mid-50s. So for me, the concept that you'll be able to discover your life's purpose and pursue it at the ripe old age of 25 is mildly ridiculous. Now, it's not to say it can't happen, it's just extraordinarily unlikely to. But I think this breeds a lot of dissatisfaction in younger people. Why am I wasting my time in this job? The job is taking me nowhere. And this makes it even harder to get a psychological contract that both an employer and an employee will be satisfied with. We produced an episode of No Bullshit Leadership on this topic a little while ago. It was episode 201, Finding Your Purpose. So it's definitely worth a listen if you're trying to find yours. Quiet quitting is just the latest manifestation of a centuries-old trend. And as with everything, the pendulum will swing back. But whether the trend we're seeing in productivity decline can be reversed remains to be seen. One thing's for sure though, if it's not reversed, then the standard of living we've all come to expect will gradually erode. And unfortunately, if that happens, it becomes less and less likely that the majority of people will be able to live their best lives.